So, this was originally supposed to be done on a stage in a church. Like, that was my initial shoot and all that kind of stuff. But unfortunately, I set everything up, got some B-roll, got a bunch of good stuff, and was halfway through filming when I realized I forgot my mic. That religion for him didn't work, that he didn't find the meaning and the purpose in life that he was looking for. I forgot my mic. This is going to be terrible. So now, here we are in my house, because it's already getting late, and I just don't have the time to go back and do it all again. So, here we are. All that aside, today's video is not going to be a typical video for myself, and small side note, I just remembered I forgot to mention, I'm wearing a Christmas sweater because today was Ugly Christmas Sweater Day, and this is a sweater of a cow with hello, Bell. So, I've been listening to that bell all day. It's very annoying. And I figured if my students had to suffer, and my coworkers had to suffer with it, they heard me down the hallway the whole day. If they had to suffer, so do you. Without further ado, let's actually get into this video. And it's not one I typically make, because I'm not really much of an apologetics guy. That's just not my calling, not really who I am. And I'm making this primarily for a project for one of my classes, for master's book and all that, right? And I figured that one of you might be able to actually benefit from hearing what I've been learning about and all the stuff that I have to know. We're going to be talking a little bit about apologetic stuff today. Right? Because one of the things that I've come across here and again is that this idea that Christianity and religion in general is for the ignorant, and then the real intellectual people and the true scientists are all atheists. And that's not necessarily true. I mean, there are some ignorant atheists out there, and there are also some ignorant Christians, but there are also some reasonably very scientifically minded Christians and reasonably very scientifically minded atheists out there. Right? In order to be scientific, it doesn't mean that you have to accept that there is no God. That's not how it works. And the Christian worldview is very harmonious with the scientific worldview. Right? It doesn't mean that they could be opposites. They can be harmonious together. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit today. But the things that kind of come into question a lot is these questions of the origin of humanity, the origin of the cosmos, because that's the main difference between the secular view and the Christian view. Because the Christian view says, oh yeah, there's a creator, that's the how and the why. Right? It got here because he created it. Right? And it's all for his purposes. Now the secular view says, oh, it's just here. Right, which really just pushes off the question, because there's only two ways you can take that. Either it blipped into existence, which is Big Bang stuff and all that fun stuff, which only begets of why and how, and and one of the recent things is maybe it existed before, right, and then coalesce and then burst back out, and then it's going to eventually coalesce back into itself, which only begs the question of how did that start, why is that a thing, why do we have space, why do we have time if these things have already just existed? And there's a whole lot of questions to still be had. It doesn't explain the beginning of anything. If there even is a beginning according to the worldview, if there isn't, why? It's a whole endless rabbit hole. But for the Christian worldview, we have a definite start, which is God. But the whole point of this video is to prove to you that the Christian viewpoint is tenable, should be respected. And no, we're not just a bunch of ignorant people that just refute science. And to do that, I'm going to give you a few of the different viewpoints that Christians can have, because not all Christians agree. But we got to lay out some groundwork first, right? And that groundwork has to do with what is known as evolution. Right? Because the thing is that when we refer to evolution as a society now, we are referring to macroevolution. Macroevolution is saying that one species becomes another, right? That's the theory of evolution, all that fun stuff. But when it comes to microevolution, Christians would agree that that is absolutely a thing, right? And that's what Darwin observed on the Galapagos Islands, right? Because when you see those finches, right, with all the different beaks and all that kind of stuff, it's no different than when you look at dogs, because we just did it artificially, right? Humans just kind of created the microevolution with dogs, because a Chihuahua and a Mastiff are the same species. We just bred them to look different. Right? We just bred different qualities. We intentionally did microevolution. And that's like really the best example of it all. And so, we believe in that, right? We believe that adaptation and survival of the fittest and all that is definitely a thing. But we do not believe, well, most of us do not believe, that it can happen in the creation of new species. We believe that a species is a species is a species, and each individual species was created by God. God didn't make Chihuahuas and Masters, but he made the general dog. Does that make sense? But with all that aside, right, all that groundwork laid out here, let's talk about the first extreme, which is young Earth creationism. Right, and I say this is an extreme because this is very heavy on the scripture side and very light on the science side. Because the thing is about young Earth creationism is that they believe that the world was created in 6 little 24-hour periods, 6 little days. Right? They have a very, very little reading of Genesis. And there's a lot of weak points that come into this. One weakness of this belief, of this point of view for Christians, is that it is not supported by science at all. Right? There is nothing within science that would point to the universe as young as they suggest, because they think it's as young as 6,000 years old. And science would suggest that the universe itself is a lot older than that, right? Millions of billions of years. And so there's kind of this disconnect now between what we observe in science and what they believe Scripture says. And I say they believe because the Scripture itself isn't that literal, isn't that literal in that way. Because the thing is that the way the Hebrew is worded, it's not literal days. It can be literal days, but it can also be ages, time periods, right? If I say in English, back in my day, right, that doesn't necessarily mean back in a 24-hour period. That's a general time period. And it was kind of similar of a vibe when it comes to Hebrew, right? The Hebrew words that are used for days here. It can mean a time period. It can mean an age. Like the Hebrew itself can mean that. And so the original language is not explicitly 24-hour periods. It could be. It could have been the intention, but also could have just meant ages and time periods. It's not entirely clear. And so this dependence on a little 24-hour period is artificial at best. And now there's another view here, right, that will go to the other extreme, which is evolutionary creation, which is very hard on the science, very extreme in this end, very kind of loose on the scripture. So they would say, Hazel, what are you doing? This is my cat Hazel. Hi, she's curious as to what I'm doing. But evolutionary creationism is all about how God governed the process of evolution, macroevolution, right? The theory of evolution. They would agree with everything science says to the T. And follow along those theories of evolution and all that kind of stuff, suggesting that God just kind of governed over these things. And it would chalk up the Genesis account of creation to being just a part of the ancient Near Eastern worldview. They say it's no different than the firmament in the sky as they saw it, right? Now, there are some references in the Bible to a firmament, which I don't believe in, right? But it's in, like, the story of the flood. And it mentions, like, it pouring forth from the great deep and all that. That has to do with the firmament as part of the ancient Near Eastern worldview that we don't agree with today, right? Because we know where rain comes from and all that fun stuff. But the point of the narrative in the flood is that rain came down and flooded the earth. Well, that's just the thing, is that we can agree, even if we have a different scientific understanding, we have a new scientific understanding of how rain works, we agree with the biblical account that, yeah, it rained. Now, here's the thing, right, is that when it comes to the Genesis account, that sets up a lot, though. We can't just throw that away, because that also leads right into Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman. And if we just chalk that up to the ancient Near Eastern worldview, because they didn't understand what we know in science now, then we have to call into question the story of Adam and Eve, which sets up the narrative of the Bible, which sets up that idea of fallen humanity, which we are still dealing with in the modern day. Now, if we're calling that into question, then we have a lot more things to call into question, because if we just chalk it up to, science says something different. Well, science says something different about miracles too. Science says that bodies don't come back from the dead. Well, then that calls into question the resurrection of Christ and all kinds of nasty little things that can come out of this. It's a very slippery slope. There's a whole lot of stuff that we're kind of very loose on. And it makes me feel very uncomfortable dealing with that. And I'm much harder on Scripture than they would be. Which brings me to my viewpoint, what I would call the reasonable middle ground, which is very strong Scripture and very strong science. Right? And this is what people like Hugh Ross would have to say. This is what's called Old Earth creationism. And now for Old Earth creationism, what they believe is that, yeah, we believe in the Genesis account, right, of creation. But we also believe that those days, because the Hebrew is kind of vague, that they can mean 24-hour periods, or they can mean ages, or they can mean time periods, and that allows us to fit what we have observed in science about the age of the universe. We disagree with macroevolution. We say, no, everything was made according to their kind because that's what the Genesis account says. And that's what we also observe. We don't observe species becoming other species. Right? Because people like Hugh Ross would suggest that Scripture and nature should reflect one another, that they ought to be consistent with one another. What we observe and what we read ought to be the same. And that is true. Right? Because we do not observe one species becoming another. But we do observe variations in the species itself. Yeah, cool. That makes sense. And which is consistent with the Genesis account of God making every species according to their kind, right? It would make sense then that that's what we observe. If you want to know more about this stuff, I highly encourage you to read the likes of Lee Strobel, the likes of especially Hugh Ross, if you're really into the science stuff, and also Josh McDowell, because they were all atheists that sought to disprove Christianity. And to prove this point, right, and to prove my point a little more as well, is to tell you the story of Josh McDowell. Because Josh McDowell had grown up in a religious background, right, in a very religious community. And religion for him didn't work out, right? He didn't find that meaning, that purpose that he was seeking. So he gave up on it, right? Became an atheist, and he decided to seek meaning, decided to seek purpose in education and prestige. And that didn't work out for him either. And he describes that in the beginning of his book, The New Evidence Without a Book, all that fun stuff. Good book, highly recommend it. It's a lot of notes that he took because while he was on his college campus, he noticed a group of people that had certain conviction in their eyes. He knew that they had that purpose, that meaning that he was so desperately craving. And when he asked them about it, they told him the reason for their purpose and meaning was Jesus Christ. And he refused to accept it. So they pushed him to go and examine the evidence, to look for himself and examine for himself the claims that Christ made. And so after a while, he relented. He left college for a little bit, went around the U.S. and Europe, going between libraries and all kinds of stuff, looking at the evidence, examining these claims. And at the end of his journey, he found himself in a library in London when it hit him all of a sudden that it was true, that Christianity was true. Yet he didn't accept it in his heart. He knew in his mind that it was true, but his heart wouldn't accept it. It wasn't until later on that he finally accepted Christ, and that his heart was able to get over it. And I think that really points to something very important, and why I'm not too big on apologetics. Because most of the people that I've talked to that are hung up about something with Christianity aren't really hung up with the intellectual side of it. They aren't hung up on a mind issue. They'll say they are, but whenever I actually present reasonable arguments, they don't even want to hear it. Because to them, it's a heart issue and not a mind issue. They got an issue with God, not an issue with the science. Because there is a very reasonable and very true argument for Christianity if you're just willing to do the research. problem is that people don't want it to be true. They don't want to accept the reality of Christ. Because when you accept it, it means a whole lot. It means you all of a sudden have a responsibility. It means all of a sudden you got to live a certain way. And Josh McDowell reports on that in his introduction. He says, yeah, I didn't want to do it because it meant I would have to change how I live my life. And he didn't want to change his life. But he eventually realized that he was just being intellectually dishonest. And eventually got over it. I think that's the heart root of this issue. It's not a matter of the science. It's not a matter of the mind. It's a matter of the heart that's the issue. And that's how we're going to reach others. It's not by intellectualism. It's not by science. It's not by apologetics. All it's doing is just removing reasons for them to resist Christianity. And it's removing all the excuses. That's all it's doing. Which is a good thing, right? I believe in removing any excuse. But my job, I believe, right, what I'm called to do is not to remove the excuses via science and all that, but it's to start addressing that heart issue. And of course, I, as you know, am very much more focused on this aspect of it all. Because I am very intellectual in nature. But I also recognize that this is primarily a heart issue. That's what it all means at the end of the day, is your heart. Because really, what God's worried about is a lot less what's out here and a lot more what's in here. And that's true for humanity too. Because if we really believe that the sky is green, the sky is going to look pretty green to us. Because it's what we believe that matters. Because I can give you evidence all day long. But there's plenty of books already written about that. Right? Read The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. Read The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. Read or watch anything by Hugh Watts. You can watch free videos from online that proves that science is very consistent with what we see in Scripture. Just providing the evidence is not going to convince you. It's dealing with that heart issue is what's going to really convince you to give your life to Christ. And if you feel like you've been being intellectually dishonest, if you feel like you know exactly what that heart issue is, I want to encourage you to address it finally. To get right with God. To finally accept Him into your life. Because yeah, it's going to mean that your life is going to change. It's going to mean that a whole lot is about to be different. That means all of a sudden you're going to have to be a good person and all that, right? But it's all going to be for good. It will bring you such a joy, such a meaning, such a purpose in life. It'll fill that emptiness that you feel. Only a relationship with God can fix that. Not outward religion, but inward faith. Thanks for watching, and I'm sorry, I know I haven't been posting a lot. Because, as I mentioned, I am a high school teacher now, and I also have other ministry stuff to do with, and I got a whole bunch of stuff going on, and I have a life. I'm busy. I'm very busy. And I'm sorry, I don't have the time to devote to this as I ought to. I've been very unfaithful in posting here. I'm going to try to do a little better, especially as I'm kind of figuring out a new space to kind of do it in, with my apartment and all that. So I'm trying to figure it out. I promise. And I have not forgotten about this channel. I haven't forgotten about you guys. And I if you've watched it this far, I want to thank you. Because I don't deserve people like you. And I ask for your continued patience and your forgiveness of my unfaithfulness in posting here. And patience as I try to get back on track with it. So, till next time, whenever that is.